always the person interested in the history of things that I'm involved in. I went over the tapes, actually, for Karen Ann Harlos and tried to clean up the original convention tapes. I'm sort of, I wanted to ask, you know, obviously I've gotten, and I've listened to them a million times, but I sort of want to get the on-the-ground perspective about what it was like at those beginning conventions. What happened outside the business area? Why was the Dallas Accord needed so badly in 1974? Those types of things I would love to hear about.
When I got to Denver for the convention, my committee had to go into service immediately, and I got in a little room off to the side of the main hall with about 6 or 7 other people, and we spent most of our time trying to work out the bylaws and the rules for the convention. Like I said, the original title was Constitution, Bylaws, and Rules Committee. So we had a lot piled on our plate. And I had some good people and came up with some great ideas. And then we reported to Dave Nolan. Now, what I'm saying here is when we gave a preliminary report to David Nolan, while they were still taking care of other business at the convention, we had come up with the idea of having a statement of principles and that it could not be amended by less than a 7/8 vote at any convention in the future. Except David said we need to have a one-time exception for the next convention for them to reconsider everything that we've done here, and that would be the 1974 convention. So I said, well, okay, then they can reconsider the statement of principles for a one-time only vote of 3/4. David kind of winced and said, no, I think we better go with 2/3. So and we did. And that was the only time that David ever said, no, I think he went too far. And when we finally delivered the report, he had no other objections to anything in our rules at that time. And so we went ahead. It was a complete surprise to everyone that we had required that the party have a statement of principles. But in the end, it was unanimously adopted. Primarily, it was Dr. Hosper's text that was approved of, and that became the statement of principles. And I was the principal author of the 7/8 rule.
That's amazing. So one of those things that the 7/8 rule has saved us, I mean, in my opinion, has saved us from ourselves so many times going forward from that point. I mean, even last year, everybody's like, we want to change the 7/8 rule. And like, of course, you can't get 7/8 to change the 7/8 rule, right? So like, we've had this sort of North Star, if you will, for our party that has governed our principles and where we go and how we do it. And even though there have been a number of, say, infiltrations of different, I wouldn't say they were not libertarian, but different schools of libertarianism into the party, ultimately that statement of principles has saved us. So what sort of happened after, like, we have the Dallas Accord itself, the idea and the lore, if you will, in the party is that there needed to be left room for the anarchists in the party. Could you go a little more into that part of it?
Well, I think virtually everybody at the Denver convention in '72 were limited government libertarians. And by limited government, we meant severely limited government libertarians. By 1974, Murray Rothbard had come over, and the anarchist people had come over, and I still, at that time, remained a limited government libertarian. But just as David Nolan anticipated, we needed to make a little tweaking to the statement of principles in order to make it clear that anarchists were acceptable in the Libertarian Party. And that's how it came about. That nobody called it the Dallas Accord in 1974. It was just an amendment to the statement of principles, where we said things like where governments exist and substituted a free market economy for the word capitalism. And the anarchists accepted those changes as being enough to make them feel welcome. And it passed by a 2/3 vote. Whereas, once again, taking my hat off to David Nolan, if he'd gone with my 3/4 vote, we probably would have not been able to survive as a party because we would have excluded too many libertarians. But fortunately, the wisdom of David Nolan prevailed, and the convention was able to make that change. And from now on, it's 7/8.
I know that you went inactive for a while, and I've actually done the same thing. I was very active, between certain times, and then sort of left and came back when there was a precipitating event that made me come back. Like I mentioned before, the last one was Trump. What were your reasons for going inactive? When did you do that, and why did you come back?
Well, I ran as the first libertarian, one of two of the first libertarian candidates for Congress in Oklahoma in 1980. We had the first Libertarian Party primary in Oklahoma ever, and I lost that primary by 4 votes. So my opponent became the candidate for Congress, and I went on, which did not hurt my feelings at all, since I had recruited the guy and he was outstanding. So we went ahead until about the mid-1980s when, well, I don't want to get into a big digression about something called the Penn Square Bank failure, but there was a big failure in Oklahoma of a bank that had been putting out excessive amounts of loans into the oil business, and it finally collapsed. And when it collapsed, it caused my swimming pool business to collapse because all those high roller oil men no longer wanted to buy swimming pools. And then after that came, I had to undergo a divorce on pretty amiable terms. And then on top of that, the house I was living in, which had originally belonged to my grandfather, was hit by an arsonist twice. And I was left with no good place to live except to go back to the family farm in eastern Oklahoma. And that's where I stayed for a few years until I returned back to Oklahoma City in the 90s.
So you went through all of this, and then what was the sort of precipitating event for you becoming politically active again?
Well, after I returned to Oklahoma City, I continued to participate in the background when other younger people were carrying the ball. I didn't feel compelled to try to negotiate things. Really, it was a big shock to me when David Nolan died. I'd like to point out that David Nolan was 14 months my junior when we formed the party. His birthday was in November, and I was born 14 months earlier in 1942 in September. So the fact that the guy was a little younger than me, had a stroke, I just thought, no, we were supposed to both go till we're in our 80s. What's the deal here? And so I said, well, whatever time I have left, I need to bear down and do something to assist the Libertarian Party more than just resting on my laurels.
So coming back, David Nolan dying, you've been sort of a North Star for many of us in the party, sort of a corrective influence in some ways within the party itself. One of the things I wanted to ask was, so what was it like at the last presidential convention, sort of being around? I mean, we are at general, there's a lot of mixes, but there's not a lot of people that have been around for a long time in the Libertarian Party. Some of us are, or some of us have come in and out and done, whatever. The people who've been around a long time have their own lives and they've led them. What was it like in 2016? Gary Johnson, Bill Weld, the vice presidential race. Larry Sharp is my mentor and good friend, and that he lost by only a few votes. What was the the energy at that convention for you? How did that sort of, it's kind of hard to explain. I'm almost looking for like, what was it like for you there at the 2016 convention?
Well, I didn't decide to go to the convention until almost the last minute. I was up in North Carolina visiting with my son, and I told him, I said, well, why don't we make a little road trip and go down to the convention at Orlando, and I can make this donation to the Libertarian Party of the digitized versions of the tapes I have from the 1972 and 74 conventions. I had converted them from analog reel-to-reel tape into MP3s and OGG files, so they were digital and could be put on a disc. And I went down there figuring, okay, I'm going to get an opportunity to make a little 2-3 minute speech and make the contribution of the tapes, and I would get polite applause, and then I would just melt back into obscurity. And it was frankly a shock to me that I got a standing ovation. I was puzzled at the time, is what is this standing ovation for? I'm just donating some recordings from the early days of the party and everything like that. And then the next day, I was even more surprised when Nick Sarwark asked me to nominate him for party chair. So, of course, I didn't make a very good nominating speech because I was taken off guard and I was still in shock. But at any rate, he won and we finished the convention. Now, I would say about the nominations for the president, vice president, I wasn't really well impressed with any candidates at that time. Some of them not so bad. I thought, well, maybe Gary Johnson will get more radical if he gets the nomination. He'll have a burden off his shoulders that he doesn't want to. Anyway, I was making a wild guess and hoping that was going to work out. And Bill Weld, I didn't vote for him. I was very close to Bill Weld for several minutes at the convention, observing him at arm's length. And frankly, Richard Nixon came to Oklahoma City and gave a talk in 1968 when he was running for president. And at the time, I was standing next to Bill Weld, and I thought, this guy smells like Richard Nixon to me. And so I wasn't for him at all. But that was basically what my response was coming out of the convention in 2016 was, well, holy mackerel, I'm not as obscure as I thought I was. So I need to do something to contribute to this party. If they seem to hold me in esteem, I want to do something to advance the party further than just sitting back and say, hey, I'm Mr. 7/8.